Welcome, everybody, to the next episode of the Cannabis Review. I'm delighted to be joined in this episode by John Hudak, who's the Deputy Director of the Centre for Effective Public Management and a Senior Fellow in Government Studies at the Brookings Institute. How are you keeping today, John?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. It's very much appreciated.
My pleasure.
So a couple of topics I wanted to talk to you about, and maybe first and foremost, we'll get the audience up to speed. How did you get involved at the Brookings Institute, and what was your first initial start in the cannabis industry, or covering the cannabis industry, should I say?
To be honest, after I got out of graduate school, or as I was nearing the end of graduate school, I was expecting to go into a teaching job at a university. And I got someone reached out to me from Brookings. They had an opening to see if I was interested in applying. Everything moved sort of quickly. I didn't expect to be working at a think tank ultimately, but that was 10 years ago, and here I am still churning stuff out at Brookings. In terms of how I started in cannabis, that was very accidental. I actually had a colleague who recommended I take a look at some work that was being done around polling in Colorado and Washington before those two states legalized cannabis. And he said, you ask a lot of questions in your research that might be applicable to cannabis. And I sort of laughed him out of my office, truth be told. And eventually I took a look at some of the things he was sending me, and I found the topic really interesting, and launched a project in 2014 evaluating Colorado's implementation of their legal cannabis system, and just kept building it into a broader part of my research portfolio.
Yeah, and for those who don't know, the Brookings Institute is one of the most revered think tanks in the world. And when they release a paper on a topic, it generally moves the needle far more than, let's say, some of the industry experts. So it was a great review of it. And then your book that you released in 2016, what was the reasoning behind that? You just developed a huge amount of knowledge.
Yeah, there was a lot of research going on that wasn't being tied together, I think, in a concise way. There were some books on cannabis that were very laser focused on specific topics. There were other ones that were hundreds and hundreds of pages long. And Brookings was actually interested in putting together a series of books that explained short histories on a variety of policy topics. And they asked me if I'd be interested in writing one on cannabis, and I, of course, was. And so what I ended up putting together was a policy history, largely in the 1900s and 2000s, although some earlier dates appear in the book as well, to explain the policy and political history of cannabis, largely in the United States, although there's a little bit in there about nations abroad that have dealt with the issue. And it serves more as almost like a For Dummies book, catch you up to speed on what's gone on in cannabis policy over 150-year period. And it's a light read, an easy read. It's a beach read, people tell me. And so obviously I recommend it.
Yeah, everybody, the link for the book will be posted in the description below. You'll be able to click on it and buy it directly. So the reason I wanted to kind of focus as much as I can on Ireland with your skill set, because you guys obviously no federal legalization yet, but there's some way forward as to what an industry would look like. Over in Ireland, we're still stuck with a medical cannabis program where even if a doctor prescribes it, it has to be okayed by a secondary consultant who generally is over the age of 65, 70 and doesn't really understand what they might be even remotely talking about. So what the first topic I wanted to talk about was how cannabis emerged from the shadows, one of the types of parts of your book. So how did cannabis emerge from the shadows in America? What was the first initial pillar that got the industry out in the open for everybody?
During the 1970s and 1980s, early 1980s in the United States, views on cannabis began to shift some, and you saw some states stepping up to decriminalize cannabis. That is, to make a cannabis crime the equivalent of a speeding ticket or a parking ticket. A few states moved forward with that approach, and it was seen as a prioritization of police dollars. That is, that there were more important things for police departments to deal with than low-level cannabis offenses. This was during a period of fairly high crime rates in the United States, particularly violent crime rates. We went back into a period of shadows when Ronald Reagan became president and really began to reiterate the war on drugs in the United States. But ultimately, the years of racial strife, police power, a real focus on criminalization of a lot of things, including low-level drug offenses, began to get displaced, oddly enough, by the AIDS epidemic in the United States. And what you found was in some big cities, particularly in San Francisco, but also in LA and New York and elsewhere, doctors and nurses, and most importantly, patients, were recognizing that cannabis helped with some of the side effects of the pharmaceuticals, early pharmaceuticals being used to treat HIV and AIDS. And that began to put cracks in this system where people were looking at cannabis as something not as terrible as the government was telling them it was, and something that might actually, under certain circumstances, have medical benefits. And so began the path toward reform, starting really in the mid-1990s in the United States and really skyrocketing forward to today.
Okay, so great little breakdown there. So what do you think have been the, let's say, the two biggest benefits of cannabis coming out into the main industry market? Has it been revenue for the government, social equity programs, patient access? What do you think if a politician from Ireland is looking at this wondering why would we legalize it? What are the kind of two pillars that people would be looking at going, okay, it's worth a run?
So when I advise state and local governments on cannabis reform, one of the things I always tell them is to discount the revenue that comes in. It's never as much as people imagine it's going to be. It's a significant amount of money, no doubt. But it's important to set citizen expectations about how much money that will mean, how much money it means relative to the larger municipal or state budget, and certainly what that money will actually end up doing in terms of dealing with budget deficits or the ability to fund certain programs. The two areas that I think, though, it is most impactful, cannabis reform, first is for patient care. There are a lot of patients in the United States who will tell you that they benefit significantly from the use of cannabis, whether it's for pain management, whether it's to deal with seizure disorders, whether it's to deal with a lack of appetite for a variety of reasons, most commonly associated with HIV/AIDS or chemotherapy treatments for cancer, et cetera. For some people, it helps them sleep. For some people, it helps them focus. There's a lot of benefits either demonstrated through government regulatory processes or just anecdotally from patients that they are getting those types of benefits without traditional pharmaceuticals, some of which, particularly for pain management, come with significant risks and obviously risks for addiction and dependence as well. The second area in which I think it has a major impact in the United States is in the criminal justice space. The idea that states are no longer arresting individuals for low-level cannabis offenses in mass numbers is huge. Now, one of the problems we've had in the United States is that while the number of arrests in a lot of states that have legalized cannabis have plummeted, the racial disparities in the remaining arrests remain. And so there's a lot of work to do in the criminal justice space with regard to cannabis law enforcement. But ultimately, we are arresting hundreds of thousands of fewer people in states that have legalized. And that means a different life trajectory for those individuals who have been spared what, 5, 10, 15 years ago would have landed them in jail.
Okay, so two very good points for we've got a National Day of Action over here in Ireland on the 23rd of August where Patients for Safe Access, everybody's joining at the Department of Health. So there seems to be a lot of steam coming in the Irish industry at the moment. Do you guys look at the European sector at all, or do you just focus strictly on the American industry?
There's a pretty large focus on the American industry and advocacy space and policy space. There's so much going on here and changing all the time. It takes up a lot of our time. But, I do think that there are lessons to be learned from the European model, in particular, especially with regard to medical cannabis research. Medical cannabis research has been stymied in the United States because of ideological reasons, because of bureaucratic reasons, and really for nonsensical reasons in general. Research into medical cannabis and the efficacy of medical cannabis for a variety of conditions and diseases has really grown significantly in places like the EU, in Israel, and elsewhere, where those types of bureaucratic barriers are reduced relative to the American model. And what I often tell policymakers in the US is that Europe is having our lunch. We could be doing this type of cutting edge research, but Europe is doing it for us. And it's a real problem, but it demonstrates that even in a peer government like the EU, the US doesn't have to be afraid of at least allowing the freedom to conduct research into this substance and better understand what it will mean for prospective patients.
Yeah, and I think that's where Europe at the moment seems to be a little all over the place when it comes to patient access. So we've got Spain is legalizing a medical cannabis program in the end of December, but it's still up in the air as to is it specialists allowed to prescribe it? Are they allowed to flower? Whereas over in Ireland, you've got maybe 7 like neuroplasticity and post chemo nausea that are allowed on the list. But again, a consultant who has nothing to do with the patient, that a doctor has to be the one to sign off on it, and it creates that extra barrier. That how would you when you did your paper, the report on the medical marijuana mess, what was that paper targeted at health officials, or was it targeted at a broader consumer basis?
Yeah, it was targeted at policymakers who work in the public health sector, as well as healthcare professionals as well. You had mentioned at the outset of the podcast that the secondary consultants in Ireland who need to sign off on doctors' prescriptions for cannabis are oftentimes older practitioners. That's a problem we face in the United States as well. You have entire classes of doctors who went through medical school being taught that cannabis is bad in all circumstances. It's hard to break people out of that, particularly older practitioners who are more set in their ways, who have rigid ideologies about these substances. That's certainly not a problem that exists simply in Ireland or in Europe, but in the United States and elsewhere around the world, particularly Latin America as well. And so, what I oftentimes tell individuals who are working to change laws around medical cannabis is that, yes, it's important to change the law. That's an important first step. But you also have to change the culture within allied health professions to understand the newest and latest research on cannabis, both in terms of medical efficacy, but also in terms of the risks and side effects of it, or the lack thereof in many cases, and to better understand what patient needs are and what the risks of alternative therapies alternative to cannabis would mean. And that's particularly important in the pain management space, as I mentioned, where addiction and dependence issues are significant, as well as overdose issues. But it's true in a variety of areas of medicine. If you have a doctor coming to the table who's not read up well on medical cannabis, that doctor is not doing his or her job. And so part of the reform around medical cannabis is not just law and policy, but it's in medical education at medical schools, but also continuing medical education for practicing doctors and nurses.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about the North American companies taking a foothold in the European industry, but the one thing I actually see them dominating hands down and having no competition is the expertise coming over here to educate the doctors en masse, the Peter Grimspoons of the world, coming over here and spreading their knowledge and expertise, I think is one of the biggest monetization points for the North American industry at the moment, as opposed to them all thinking they can sell tons of flower in a market that doesn't even have a solidified base yet.
Yeah, I think that's right. And what's most important, I think, it's true in the United States, it's true abroad as well, is that individuals who are, let's say, new to cannabis or considering thinking differently about cannabis, the messenger for the information is critically important. They want to hear from doctors, they want to hear from nurses, they want to hear from PhDs, they want to hear from people in suits. They're going to believe people who look differently than their imagined stereotype of a cannabis user or a cannabis advocate. And here in the United States, we have a sort of mixed bag when it comes to the way that individuals present themselves while lobbying or advocating in other settings for medical cannabis or adult use cannabis. And what you see is that the more professionalized that movement is and the more professionalized that movement appears, the more likely individuals will be receptive to that message. And so that's critical. Doctors hearing from doctors and nurses about their own experience clinically cannot be overmatched by, papers that they're reading in academic journals or advocacy messages that they're hearing that are more, let's say, stereotypical in nature.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you anymore. When I was doing my research, I came across myself saying this is one of the most influential voices in American cannabis, and you haven't disappointed at all, John. It's been absolutely amazing talking to you, and hopefully we get to talk again in 12 months' time, and we can give you an update on what's happening over here in Europe. But thank you very much for now.
Thank you.
See you on our next episode, everybody.